Hello and welcome. For the next installment of MASSP's ongoing Leader to Leader series, we are going to have a panel discussion with special guests Bethany Wicksall and Beth Bullion from the State Budget Office. Principals need to know firsthand what impact the ongoing pandemic might have on school budgets. Many of you are already getting pulled into district budget discussions for next school year, and many more will be soon. But the learning curve for understanding Michigan's K-12 budget process is steep. Even central office administrators struggle to keep track of all the moving pieces, and that is exacerbated when trying to translate revenue projections down to the building level. So this week, we've put together a brief Know Before You Go video to review the essentials of Michigan's K-12 budget process that you'll want to know in advance to get the most out of Thursday's discussion. Our learning targets for this video are to provide a basic primer about the state budget process and the specifics on how schools are funded. By the end of this video, we hope you will have an understanding of how and where school funding comes from, which of the many moving parts is most impactful on the resources that flow to your building, and what the timeline might look like moving forward. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Kefchin, and I'm MASSP's Director of Government Relations. As we have throughout our Leader to Leader series, we encourage you to share your learning with us and your colleagues via social media. So let's start with a review of how school funding is structured in Michigan and how we got to where we are today. So to begin, I'm going to go back in time to 1993, pre-Proposal A. Prior to Proposal A, about 2/3 of school funding came from local sources. Immediately after Proposal A passed, though, that picture changed drastically, and about 80% of school funding in Michigan came from state sources. This had several effects, which I'll review. But one of the most important for understanding how the current pandemic impacts school funding is that Proposal A made schools almost entirely dependent on the legislature and Lansing for funding, rather than their local communities. So why make the change? The primary reason for this change was because Proposal A shifted school funding away from property taxes as a primary source of funding and toward other revenue. Indeed, the primary motivation behind Proposal A was a desire to lower property taxes in Michigan, which were quite high. And from that perspective, Proposal A was a resounding success. Prior to Prop A, 2/3 of school funding came from property taxes, with only 1/3 coming from other sources. Proposal A flipped that 180 degrees, lowering property tax rates and putting in place the cap on property tax growth that we still have today. Proposal A did more than just lower property taxes, though. For better and worse, it put in place most of the school funding structure we have today. Proposal A was the origin of the per-pupil funding formula. Previously, funding went to districts directly and did not move around with students. It increased the sales tax from 4 cents to 6 cents and used the revenue to replace property taxes. It drastically reduced the inequities between different regions of the state that existed when property taxes, and therefore property values, determined most of school funding. And it shifted the responsibility to pay for MIPSers, the public school employee pension system, away from the state and onto local districts. Prior to Proposal A, the state paid the full cost of retirement for school employees. So now that we have a common understanding of how school funding is roughly structured in Michigan, let's briefly examine which taxes and other revenue sources pay into the school aid budget. As we know already, Proposal A gave 2 cents of the 6-cent sales tax directly to schools. Schools also get a portion of the remaining 4 cents, making sales tax the single biggest revenue source for school funding. Income tax is second. Property taxes like the state education tax and the real estate transfer tax, which used to play such a large role in school funding, are down to less than 20% of the total these days. And the lottery? Schools get 100% of lottery proceeds, but that $1 billion is only around 7% of the total school aid budget. So consider what impact COVID-19 is going to have on the school aid fund. With consumers staying home instead of going shopping, people are making fewer purchases. Additionally, many people don't have the money to make purchases because they've lost their jobs. This means the state is going to collect significantly less sales tax during this crisis. Similarly, with so many people unemployed, the income tax that would normally come out of people's paychecks is also going to go down. And the longer it takes to contain the virus, the harder the hit. Next, let's talk about where school aid fund dollars are spent and which line items are the most costly. As you can see here, the vast majority of the K-12 budget goes toward the foundation allowance, with special ed, MIPSers, federally mandated programs, early childhood, and at-risk making up most of the rest. The other programs section of the budget is all the other little programs in the budget, and while some of them might be considered pork projects, most of them are things like isolated district funding, state testing costs, millage equalization, and ISD operations funding that are as crucial to sustaining operations in those districts and programs as the bigger line items are to local districts. In the context of COVID-19, this is important because state revenue projections are showing a drop of between $1 and $3 billion this fiscal year and between $1 and $4 billion in the 2020-21 fiscal year. Shortfalls that large are going to force some potentially big cuts in school funding. And as we look at this graph, we see that only a handful of line items have enough revenue in them to backfill such a large cut. MIPSers is constitutionally guaranteed and can't be cut, so don't worry about your retirement. Similarly, special ed and the other federally mandated programs can't be cut, or Michigan would lose federal funding, which would dig the hole deeper. And even if we entirely eliminated all state funding for state testing, ISD operations, isolated district funding, and the like, it still wouldn't be enough to entirely fill even a $1 billion loss of revenue. Moreover, we won't do that, since those cuts would effectively eliminate these crucial programs and shutter many school districts. In other words, there's just no way to fill such a large deficit without making cuts to things like the foundation allowance. We've covered a lot of ground already, but just understanding how schools get their money, from where, and how the money is spent doesn't give us a full picture. There are some other crucial factors at play that are worth reviewing. First, we've focused exclusively so far on the school aid fund. But ever since the state started diverting school aid revenue to higher education and community colleges roughly a decade ago, the school aid fund and the state's general fund have become intertwined. Just under $800 million of school aid revenue is being used to prop up those two budgets, and there is another $1 billion of higher ed spending that could still be paid using school aid money. In other words, schools don't just have to worry about the shortfall in school aid revenue, but the entire loss in state revenue, since K-12 money could still be used as a crutch to prop up the losses in other areas. Second, we haven't accounted for the impact of the economic downturn on MIPSers. As I noted earlier, Proposal A shifted the cost of MIPSers from the state entirely onto local districts, though at the time the rate was only about 14.5%. Then, in 2012, as the MIPSers rate climbed in the wake of the 2008 downturn and subsequent policy changes to stabilize the fund, the portion districts were supposed to pay was capped. And even though the rate continued to climb, the difference, represented by the light green section of this graph, was paid out of the school aid fund. While this has helped stabilize local districts' share of the cost, it's resulted in over $1 billion in school aid going directly to MIPSers. Even with the state picking up a big chunk of MIPSers costs, traditional public school districts still pay a hefty price for school employee pensions. As an example, I've calculated the cost of MIPSers for a hypothetical minimum foundation school district as a per pupil figure. The MIPSers rate is assessed as a percentage of a district's total payroll. For most school districts, payroll accounts for about 80% of their total budget, which means that in this case, 20% of this hypothetical district's budget goes towards MIPSers. Multiply that 20% by the minimum foundation, and you see that just over $1,600 per pupil in this hypothetical district goes to pay for MIPSers. That's on top of the $1.3 billion the state is pumping into the fund. It's also worth noting here that the $1,600 figure is generally only a cost for traditional public school districts. Most charter school employees are hired by third-party management companies and thus don't pay into MIPSers. So what does all this have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, because the state invests MIPSers dollars in the market, and the current crisis has resulted in a steep economic drop, MIPSers' unfunded liability is certain to increase. That means the rate will go up. And whether that increased rate results in districts paying more per pupil, or the state paying more off the top, the result is less money going to classrooms. During last year's budget debate, one idea floated by legislative leadership was to re-amortize the state's MIPSers debt to free up money for schools. The best analogy for understanding what this means is to imagine refinancing your mortgage. If you have a 15-year mortgage and you refinance it into a 30-year mortgage, it's going to lower your monthly payment, but extend the total time it will take you to pay off your house, and increase the amount you pay in interest overall. Michigan is currently on track to pay off the MIPSR's debt by 2038. If we were to re-amortize that debt and pay it off over a longer period of time, or bond for the debt, sort of like moving from an adjustable rate mortgage into a fixed rate mortgage, it would reduce the MIPSR's rate in the short term and free up that money to be spent in other places. When this came up in the context of the road funding debate last year, it didn't make any sense, since the market was healthy and there was concern that the legislature simply wanted to divert the savings to pay for roads instead of raising new revenue. But given the current crisis, with interest rates low, the market doing poorly, and school revenue flagging, expect this idea to resurface as a way to soften the blow to schools and protect employee retirement security. Whether it's a good choice for schools and school employees will depend entirely on the details of the proposal, though. Even with all this information, there's still a lot we don't know that's going to shape what the COVID-19 pandemic means for Michigan schools. First and foremost, we don't know how much the crisis response is going to cost the state or local districts, not in terms of lost taxes, but in money for emergency response, personal protective equipment, cleaning, and other such things. We don't know what the economic recovery will look like, and whether Michigan will bounce back quickly from this crisis or have the kind of slow or anemic recovery we saw in the wake of the 2000 and 2008 recessions. And we don't know what sort of financial aid we're going to get in the end from the federal government. For example, Michigan and other states have asked for flexibility to use federal money to replace lost tax revenue so they can avoid having to make huge budget cuts late in the fiscal year. So far, though, the answer's been no. But if that were to change, it would also be a game changer for the state and local districts. Last thing, let's review what the calendar looks like moving forward compared to what districts are used to in terms of the school aid budget process. This is a rough look at what this year could have been if it had followed the traditional budget process that districts are used to. The governor delivered her State of the State address on January 29th. Typically, the legislature would have put out preliminary budgets right before their 2-week spring recess at the beginning of April, and we would have had a reasonably clear idea of what the points of difference were. Then, after the May Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, legislative leaders and the governor would have hammered out final budget details, and schools would have had their final budgets sometime in June, though the final details usually aren't much of a surprise since every step is telegraphed along the way. That's not the case this year. The legislature never put out its budget recommendations because the pandemic hit Michigan in mid-March, and legislative session was mostly canceled for 6 weeks. Even though we're still on target to have the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference in May, that will only give us a preliminary picture this year, since the full economic impact of the crisis won't be clear, and the income tax filing deadline has been pushed back into July. Even if the legislature and governor's office are able to decide on some preliminary budget measures by June, it's likely that budgets will have to be adjusted again in the fall, after the start of the school year. And that doesn't account for any cuts the state might have to make in the current year, which could result in schools losing money that they've already budgeted for and spent during the 2019-20 school year. Michigan schools get their money from the state in 11 equal payments from October to August. If the state determines that it needs to reduce current year funding, one option is that it might do so by reducing summer state aid payments. To give you an idea of what that could mean, keep in mind that those are the payments that districts typically use to make summer payroll, balance their books at the end of the year, and cover some of the upfront costs for reopening school in the fall. This is why MASA, MASB, MSBO, and the Department of Education partnered on sending out a memo to superintendents, school boards, and school business officials on April 30th. In it, they urge districts to begin now to plan for current and future year budget cuts by involving district stakeholders, planning for multiple scenarios, and tracking pandemic-related expenses in case they can be reimbursed later. We know that some principals have already been pulled into these conversations in their district, and that more will be soon. That is why we've pulled together this video, and why we hope you will join us on May 7th for a special budget-focused leader-to-leader with a pair of Michigan's premier education funding experts, Bethany Wicksall and Beth Bullion from the State Budget Office. We will explore what the current crisis could mean for the state generally, and schools specifically, in terms that you don't need to be an education funding expert to understand. And we'll answer your questions. So thank you for watching this video, and we hope to see you on May 7th.